Software is about humans solving problems primarily. And so knowing the humans behind it has always been a great motivator for me in open source community building.
Welcome to the / podcast, where we lean into the future of IT by inviting fellow thought leaders, innovators, and problem solvers to slash through its complexity. I'm your host, James Carman, and today we're talking to Rich Bowen. Rich Bowen has been doing open source since before it was called open source. He has been with the Apache Software Foundation since the late 90s, served 6 terms on its board, and is currently VP of Conferences, running ApacheCon. By day, he is an open source strategist at AWS, where he teaches teams how to do this well. He grew up in Kenya and built the first website ever about Kenya back in 1992. He is also, by his own admission, mostly responsible for the emotional support kale. Rich is a mentor of mine, so this one is a treat. Rich, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me, James.
Okay, emotional support kale.
All right, so my wife got a plush stuffed kale years and years ago and made it an Instagram page. And at some point, I kidnapped the kale and I took it with me to Australia and took pictures of it in various exotic locations in Australia. And since then, it has traveled around the world with me. It has been to 6 continents. I believe it is the most widely traveled kale in history, and it's got an Instagram page. So it's a little bit weird, but it's become my traveling companion over the last 5 or 6 years.
Kale, yeah. All right. So it's like, what is that? Lost Henry? Is that the thing? The little doll that people do? Is that what it's called?
Yeah.
Like a little, yeah.
My kid did that in school. Flat Stanley, that one?
Flat Stanley, yeah. What was that? So, yeah. Flat Stanley, yeah. So that it's kind of like that. But it sounds like he's even more, the kale is even more traveled than him. So that's pretty cool. And, as in your bio, as I said, you've been a mentor of mine at the Apache Software Foundation. We've interacted many times through the years, but not super close, but always been a good source of advice and mentorship. So I appreciate that. Thank you very much. Kenya. Okay, I got to ask about that. I usually do like one thing from the bio, but you're an interesting dude. So Kenya, you grew up in Kenya. I haven't met a lot of people who've grown up in Kenya.
Yeah.
Tell me a little bit about that. What was that like?
Well, my parents were missionaries, and I was born at a mission hospital down on the Tanzania border, close to the Tanzania border in Tenwek. And so I grew up in Kenya, and I left Kenya to come to the U.S. for college. We visited the U.S. on and off over the years, but I then didn't go back until like 3 years ago. And after 35 years, the country had changed significantly. I'm going to get a chance to go back to Nairobi again later this year, but it's somewhat behind my passion about open source is giving nations the ability to escape from the technology hegemony, or whatever word you want to use, of the United States and Europe, and create their own sovereignty. This whole notion of digital sovereignty that's been so prevalent in the international technology conversation the last 4 or 5 years has really struck a chord with me, because watching open source in Africa is just super exciting. So anyway, I got sidetracked there, but yeah, I grew up in Kenya and went to high school in Nairobi. And so that's very much part of my growing up and identity there.
How was the education there? Because you seem like a pretty bright dude, and they have great education there.
Yeah, so Kenya was a British colony, and so the education is very much British flavored. But
Gotcha.
Of course, it's been independent for about 50 years now, and so it's got its own culturally relevant education system. And I went to a British boarding school, but they do have free mandatory education through the end of high school, and so it's a very well educated country. It's got like 98% literacy, and a lot of stereotypes that folks have about Africa are simply not true. It's a very well educated country.
Wow. And I've seen pictures. I've never been to Kenya, but I've seen pictures, and it's beautiful, gorgeous. So that's cool. Well, I hope you have a good time going back to Nairobi when you're venturing over there here soon, you said?
Well, next week I'm going to Togo, but I'm going to Nairobi in December.
In December. Oh, well, it'll be nice over there, I guess. Okay. We know one another from the Apache Software Foundation. You've been a member there for a lot longer than me, but I've been a member for quite some time as well. I really loved it. I don't get a chance to do a lot these days, but you're still enjoyed there, or you're still enjoying your time there and still very much plugged in. Apache Con. I've been to one and I really, really enjoyed it. It's a great conference. How did you get involved with kind of that organizing of Apache Con?
Well, let me lead with a slight correction. I'm no longer running the conference. I've turned that over to somebody else.
I got you.
And but I'm still very involved in it, and I'm running the hackathon at this year's conference, which is going to be in Glasgow in October. Everyone should come. But I got involved with ApacheCon, which has since been renamed to Community Over Code for a variety of reasons. But I got involved with ApacheCon all the way back in 99 because I was working on the Apache web server project and I was responsible for the documentation of that project. And someone said, you should submit a talk about this, that, and the other thing. And I thought, I really am not the expert here. I don't have anything to say, but I submitted some talks and ended up giving 4 or 5 or sometimes 6 talks at ApacheCon from 2000 through probably 2015, and got involved very early on, probably 2001, on the planning committee, and ended up being VP conferences for over 20 years running that event. And it's super exciting to me to get to meet with people from all of these various software communities and make the personal connections. One of the things that I learned early on in open source is that the text that you see on your screen is not the human that you meet at a conference. And so there's a case to be made that online conferences are more ecologically responsible, and that's certainly true. But there's just something about having a meal with someone that makes them more human to you, and that makes your work-based, your software-based interactions more meaningful, because software is about humans solving problems primarily. And so knowing the humans behind it has always been a great motivator for me in open source community building.
It was always a treat for me. Like when I see someone that I've only known their name. I don't even know if I've ever heard their names uttered out loud. You know what I mean? Like you just seen it in text for years and years and years, and you see them out somewhere at a conference or something. That's always a treat. That's one of the first things okay, so how do you say your name, Bruno?
Right.
And he was on the podcast not long ago. But yeah, like that's always a treat for me. So you mentioned, one thing you mentioned during the prep call that I didn't know about you, and I thought it was a very fascinating thing. You said you were responsible for the documentation. You were a writer.
Yeah.
By trade, is that what you did? You were a writer?
No, I mean, I've always been a bit of a writer, but when I got involved in the Apache web server project, I was using it for work. So this is all the way back in 97 when the web was still just coming into the public consciousness. My employer wanted this fancy new thing called a website, and I knew nothing about that, but it sounded like an interesting project. And I downloaded and installed the very first release of the Apache web server and tried to get it running, and the documentation was just awful. And it was written by programmers for programmers, and it wasn't written for content designers, which was still a very new field at the time, learning it as I go along. And I got on the mailing list. And at that time, it wasn't even the mailing list. It was an NTP. It was Usenet. I got on the Usenet channel, and I suppose much of your audience won't even know what that means, but I said the documentation is terrible. And one of the prominent, and this was exciting at the time, this was a name that I had seen and venerated from afar. Jim Jagilski said, well, you can fix it yourself. And so here I was being given permission by somebody whose name I had seen prominently, and him telling me, you can fix it yourself, was one of my very first introductions to the concept of everybody is a peer, is an equal in this open source thing. And so I started working on the documentation, and over the years I've I've written large portions of it and helped other people write other portions of it. And I haven't been terribly involved in it in the last 5 or 6 years. But, that was very formative in my open source experience, but also in my career, my work on the Apache web server documentation, and then subsequently my books and my public speaking have led very directly to every job I've ever had.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
I was a writer in open source long before I was a programmer, and it's been very rewarding to see the success of that project, but also of Apache as a whole.
And I want to interject something here. So when the audience, the uninitiated, if you would hear somebody, well, you can fix it yourself. You could hear that as, well, you can fix it yourself, like a nasty thing.
Right.
But if you know Jim, that is by no means the way he meant that. He meant that as an empowering thing, like, well, you can fix it yourself. That kind of a mentality, and because he's all over, community and all of that. And that is the cool thing, is that you're welcomed in to help take ownership of that product and make it better in any way you can. And that's one of the beautiful things and the magic of, open source and the Apache Software Foundation. So it was really cool. So a complaint got you in there, huh?
That's right. And, empowered me to do so many things. And that's expanded into being part of the board and being part of the community development effort and being part of the conference. And all of that is, I tend to think that the most important concept in open source is ownership. It's not me doing something to help those people over there. It's me solving my own problem and owning it. And so the Apache Foundation is my foundation. It is something that I own and take very personally. And so I want to fix the things that are broken.
It's really cool. Yeah. It's a very empowering thing too, as well. I mean, to be given agency to fix the problems that you have, and not just kind of just sit back and wait for someone to do it. You can roll up your sleeves and fix your problem and fix it for others as well. Okay. A lot. So, I spent a lot of time, my involvement at Apache was mostly in like the Apache Commons and stuff. But one of the things I did was I was assistant to the secretary. Sounds like a George Costanza thing, assistant to the traveling secretary. But I was like assistant secretary for a long time. So I filed a lot of the code grants. So all of the awesome, cool stuff coming into the organization. So I got to see a lot of really, really cool stuff. But I would say a lot of people, they probably are using some form of an Apache product in some shape or form, and they probably don't even know it. Would you find that to be true?
I would go so far as to say that if you have ever used a computing device, including your phone or your microwave, you are using Apache software, and it's completely invisible to you. And some of this is, so if you play Minecraft and you watch the startup screen, you'll see Apache scrolling by many times because it's the underlying libraries. It's the Commons libraries. It's the logging libraries. It's the data processing. If you're using, fast forward to today's big hotness, if you're using any of the AI tools, they've got Iceberg and Kafka and Flink and Log4j, and all of these other tools are back behind that as part of the, Hadoop is part of the data processing there. And you'll never see that as an end user. And I also have software that I have written running on Mars. Every computer on Mars has my code on it. And that's pretty cool. That's pretty exciting.
That is cool.
And so, yeah, Apache software is absolutely everywhere. You simply can't get away from it. And, the same can be said about something like Linux. Most computer devices on the planet and in space are running some component of Linux. Open source is just ubiquitous, and we don't even notice it. So there are Apache projects that end users will see. Things like OpenOffice are, that's the most obvious example, but it's underneath everything else.
Yeah, I know, like, one of the big reasons why AI has been able to be so big today is that we did a lot of that data wrangling throughout the 2000s and into the 2010s and all of that, like the teens. That was the big problem in the 80s, is we had these algorithms and how to do, machine learning and all that. We just didn't have data. And then there was just this explosion of data processing and data wrangling and data engineering. A lot of those tools came from Apache. I mean, as you said, like Hadoop, and that the ecosystem around Hadoop itself was just mind blowing. How many things blew up around that core technology? It's just amazing. You mentioned, let's see, we wanted to talk about Log4j. Anybody who does hear Apache, and they may know about the Log4j incident. Let's talk about that a little bit, because I was somewhat involved at the time when that all went down. But how has that impacted kind of the open source community, and what do you see? How is that whole era?
Yeah. So for those not familiar, there was a security exploit codenamed Log4Shell in the Log4j library. And I don't remember the dates of this. I'm feeling like it was 3 or 4 years ago. And it was a very significant bug that allowed an attacker to do arbitrary execution of code on your device. And that sounds very boring if you have never heard of Log4j, but it turns out that Java code is ubiquitous, and every piece of Java code written in the last decade uses Log4j as its logging mechanism. And so this code is, again, on most of the computing devices on the planet, and we're just unaware of it because it's 6 layers deep in your dependencies.
Mm-hmm.
And what happened with Log4Shell was that suddenly the governments of the world woke up to the fact that every computer in their country was running this code that was written by volunteers. And these volunteers had they had no accountability.
Mm-hmm.
And different nations around the world suddenly started to want to regulate this thing called open source software. And so my manager at the time, David Nally, ended up sitting in front of the Senate of the United States of America and trying to explain to them that this software was written by volunteers who had no project manager. They had no company that they were responsible to. They were doing it for fun. He didn't know what citizenship they held and didn't care, and that the Apache Software Foundation has a policy of not asking. And the Senate of the United States was horrified by this. And that has led directly to a lot of legislation in the EU and in the United States and in Brazil and in, nations all over the world who very suddenly woke up to this fact that their entire technological infrastructure was dependent on volunteers who were doing this for fun. And, the EU in particular has come around to understand that this is a very good thing and they should incentivize it. And so you'll see programs like the Sovereign Tech Fund out of the EU and largely in Germany that are funding people full-time to work on open source software. You'll see projects like the the organization at the Linux Foundation that is funding people to do security work.
Wow.
The Log4j story, the Log4Shell story is actually a big success because as soon as the problem was reported, within 3 days it was fixed. Now, there's the whole supply chain problem that some folks are still today running the exploitable version of this because, hey, it was fixed, I don't need to care about it. But the fact is that you do have to keep up to date on your updates, your upgrades. And that has led to this international focus on supply chains and being aware of what your dependencies are, on funding distribution networks like, the Yum update network, the DNF update, the apt-get network, but also the language-specific things like PyPy and so on that help you keep your software up to date. And that's seeing a lot more funding now. So this has been a huge boon for open source, but it's also caused a lot of regulation that probably should have been in place already. We should have been self-regulating a lot of this, and we weren't.
Mm-hmm.
And then you see the other side of it, where the United States government has defunded things like CISA that does the CVE reporting. And that's very alarming because now that's unfunded. There's organizations in Europe that are picking that up, and that's a whole other conversation. But mostly it's the awareness that Log4Shell brought to this problem that has been a real benefit to software development as a whole.
Wow. Having to sit in front of Congress because you
Right.
volunteered to work. My goodness. Poor Nally.
Yeah.
Wow. Golly. That's pretty intimidating. I'm sure that was, but yeah, I can only imagine. I'm sure it was recorded, and I haven't had a chance to go watch it, but
worth watching.
yeah, like that just does not compute, I'm sure, for a lot of the people. And never mind the fact that it's technology, but then the whole idea that, yeah, this is literally people that love doing this and doing it for the betterment of humanity and, out of the goodness of their heart, right?
Right. And unfortunately, David is able to explain these concepts to people with absolutely no backing in technology. And I think he did a fantastic job of explaining it in terms that they could grasp, not because they're dumb, but because that's just not their area of expertise. And so he explained how this is an international grassroots effort to produce software, and that it is in fact backed by a lot of big companies and small companies, but that it's primarily these self-driven, self-managed individuals that are doing it because it's a passion work. And that was hard for a lot of these politicians to get their head around.
Right. Now, you hear a lot, you mentioned kind of supply chain stuff. There's been some AI kind of stuff going on around supply chain attacks, and it's not just like the distribution networks, but inserting themselves into the build process and those sort of things. Has that been an issue at Apache? Have you guys had to patch anything like that, or have you had any dust ups with those sort of things?
Yeah, I mean, there's several layers at which AI is changing how open source looks and works. One of the most prominent is that we're seeing a lot of AI-generated patches, and a lot of them are invalid or not good patches or patching imaginary problems, and having to sort through all of the unwanted contributions has a number of side effects. These individuals that are running these projects as a passion project are finding that this is a huge additional workload. Some of them are using the tooling itself, the AI tooling itself, to help triage this influx, and some of them are just ignoring it. They're like, these are pizzas I didn't order, and I'm just going to throw them away. And
love that analogy.
There are doing a really great job of security analysis of open source, and Anthropic has some tools that are doing that and providing projects with real high quality security scanning that is resulting in actual fixes. But the majority of this influx that folks are calling AI slop patches are unwanted and unhelpful and not real security problems and just noise. And this is leading to a lot of developer burnout, not just at Apache, but across the open source ecosystem. But it's also leading to a lot of new valid contributions. And this is the part of it that's exciting to me, is that AI is allowing people with ideas to solve problems without the gating of you must know how to program in C. And there's definitely a growing pains here because it is resulting in a lot of terrible code. But I see a lot of parallels to the early days of PHP that brought a lot of junior developers into the realm of web programming that wouldn't have had access to it if they didn't have an interpreted, easy-to-learn language like PHP. And I see a lot of analogies to what's happening in AI, so that somebody like myself, who is not a professional programmer, can say, I have an idea for a solution to one of my problems, and work with Claude or whatever AI agent to craft that solution, and then present that to the community who can nitpick the technical details that I got wrong. But now I have a solution to problems that, I earlier, even a year ago, I wouldn't have been able to come up with a solution for, or would have had to pay a vendor thousands of dollars to produce something for me.
And I know I follow you on LinkedIn. Your journey has been interesting around this AI assisted engineering stuff. I think you were somewhat suspicious of it. I think, I don't know what's the best way to characterize it. I don't want to mischaracterize it, but your journey has been kind of, I wouldn't say against, but not leaning in.
Yeah.
And then your journey of leaning in and realizing you like it. I mean, tell us about that journey.
Yeah, I was very skeptical about it because I'm a writer, and everyone in my family is artists. And so my vision from reading Asimov as a kid was that computers would do the drudgery so that we can focus on the beautiful, on the art, on the creativity. And instead, what we're seeing is a lot of AI being used to produce poor quality artwork to displace real artists, and poor quality writing to displace real writers. That was my mindset going in. This summer, I wrote a book that I'd been putting off for over a decade because AI allowed me to do research. Now, I did the writing, but the AI allowed me to pull together a body of research that would have taken me years, which is why I'd been putting it off for years.
Sure.
And so there's this tension. I think both things at the same time, and the cognitive dissonance is sometimes difficult to deal with. And, my kids who are artists and my wife who is an artist can look at AI in a very different light. And of course, we put a lot of things under this nebulous heading of AI. Solving medical problems that were intractable a decade ago is super exciting. AI drawing poor quality Van Goghs is not as exciting to me. And I feel like it's a misuse of the technology. So that's the journey that I've been on, the skepticism that I've been on. But it's allowed me to solve some data problems, some research problems that were simply intractable even a year ago. And so it's both, right? It's constant tension between these two things in my mind as the tools continue to get better.
I love that idea of the research, and I do find that to be very true. As it helps me gather my thoughts, develop my thoughts better, quicker. Go look for counter arguments and look for counter examples to an idea I have. It's very, very helpful for ideation of stuff. Now, of course, I do use it to write code, but I don't necessarily consider code to be art. I guess maybe I did at one point, but it's becoming more and more mechanical. That's not really the part of coding that's the magic part. It's the problem solving, the abstraction.
I have a conference presentation called "It Was Never About the Code" that I've pitched out a couple places because open source was never about the code. And we've always been bad about explaining the purpose of open source. The purpose of open source is collaboration. It's a melding of minds. It's reaching out to people with different ideas and coming to a collaborative solution to a problem. And the code is the thing that's the output. And that was always a gating factor because somebody had to write the code. And now that nobody has to write the code, I mean, in theory, then you can focus on the collaboration. You can focus on picking the minds of experts who aren't programmers. You can find a solution to a problem from an electrical engineer that understands the problem deeply but can't write code and come up with a software solution. And that part of it's super exciting to me.
Yeah. Looking back on this is just an interesting question. Like when the core folks, I mean, how many people were involved in, the initial, like the OG Apache project, like way back in the day? 8?
On day one, it was 8 people.
8 people. The Magnificent 8. When they got together and they started to do this thing, was their mindset such that very much what you're saying, this community aspect and let's bring minds together? Or was it just some dudes who love coding and then getting together and cranking out some code and doing stuff that's just fun? Or was there this grandiose and broader vision involved from the guy?
There wasn't a grand vision. Most of the people on that original 8 that I've spoken to were folks that were running their own personal businesses using the NCSA web server, which was a student project out of the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. And the National Center for Supercomputing Activities is the NCSA. And when Rob graduated from NCSA and decided to form a company with his software, he kind of took it off the public market. And all of these individuals that were running businesses on the web said, this is unacceptable. We need to figure out a way to continue maintaining this. And several of the people on that original 8 weren't even really programmers. They were just consumers of this software that had taught themselves to maintain it. And that's where we started with borrowed code that was freeware. And then we came up with the notion of an actual legal license around that. I mean, we weren't the first to come up with that. That came out of MIT and BSD, and we borrowed from that. But yeah, it started with solving your own problems, and a lot of those people were surprised and even a little bit disgruntled that it had become this international thing that now you have to maintain as like it's a real thing.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
most of those folks are no longer involved in the effort. They've moved on to other things. A few of them still are or are elsewhere in open source. But yeah, it was always about scratching their own itch.
What was the second project? That's a curious question. I don't even know the answer.
I think the second project was Tomcat, which was a
No
Java
kidding.
project that sat directly on top of the Apache web server. I
Okay.
think that was the second official project. We also had a very close relationship with PHP, who ended up not becoming part of the Apache Software Foundation, but there's a lot of overlap between the communities.
Okay. Yeah. Now, was it called Tomcat from the beginning? Because there's a Catalina underlying part of that. Was that how did that naming? I'm trying to remember the history of that whole thing, because it was basically like allowing you to use Java stuff through the Apache web server, like a plugin for, like you have.
Yeah. And then there was also Mod Perl, which had the Perl aspects of that. No, I can't remember for certain what the initial projects were when the foundation became the foundation, but there were a number of projects in the orbit there.
And I know, this would be an interesting question for you. When I look for, open source stuff, I look for that Apache license badge, right? I want to look for Apache stuff. What makes the Apache license, so much more free than kind of the others? I think there are some that are in the same class, but isn't Apache even more so free than even the others that are in the same classification as it?
I would say that MIT and BSD have fewer restrictions. The Apache license has some patent language in there, and I'm not a licensed lawyer, but the high level view is that there are two classes of licenses. There's the MIT style and the copyleft style, like GPL. And at a very inaccurate and high level view, I would say that the BSD Apache style licenses focus on the rights of the user of the software. I'm sorry, I'm getting that backwards. The ability to, well, yeah, I mean, I guess that's right. The Apache style ones focus on the rights of the user to use the software for anything that they choose. And so there's this notion of no field of use restriction. You can use it for whatever you want, even to the extent of making money with it. And then there's the copyleft style, which focuses on the rights of, the notion that software itself should be free and that closing it up is the wrong thing to do. And so it focuses on the freedom of the software as opposed to the freedom of the consumer. And they're just slightly different mindsets, maybe not so slightly depending on who you talk to. And I'm sure that you've had conversations about licenses on this podcast, and I'm certainly not an expert there. What I like about the Apache license in particular is the ability for somebody to take it and build a business around it without any sort of restrictions on what they do from that point going forward. And the reason why I find that so valuable is that it has enabled entrepreneurs around the world, especially in developing nations, to not have to start from zero. They can take something and monetize it and build a business around it. Now, I do think that if you are building value using free software, you have something of an obligation to contribute back to keeping that alive, not just because of altruism, but also because of self-interest. If you want that thing to continue persisting, to continue being sustainable going forward, then yeah, you should invest in that and make sure that it's sustainable and you're not just working off a dead end fork off the root.
Yeah.
That's the conversation that I have most of the time at work, is trying to convince businesses to invest in the thing that they're depending on and not just consume it.
Yeah, and the GPL stuff, if I remember correctly, and again, I'm not an expert on licensing stuff, but my general understanding is that when you make derivative works off of those type of copyleft licenses, the understanding is you have to contribute it back. You under the license you're obligated. It's something along those lines, right?
You have to release your changes. Whether the upstream project is going to accept those changes back is irrelevant. You are obligated to release your code. And so when you buy a television and it has GPL code in it, they are obliged to provide you with that source code.
Okay,
and there's been a number of successful lawsuits against hardware manufacturers that include their code, GPL code, in their product. And they've forced those organizations to release that code on GitHub or in a code dump or in just some format. It's very unspecific. But, my car has GPL code in it, and I can go to jeep.com and download that code. And that is because the Free Software Foundation and the Software Freedom Conservancy pushed that all the way through the courts, and good for them, because that's an important part of sustaining our ecosystem.
Okay. So they have to release it, make it available, open it up to all of the derivative works if you're going to base it on that sort of thing. But Apache doesn't require that.
It doesn't.
But we would like for you to push.
The big philosophical difference in the free and open source software worlds is between those two concepts. Whether you're free to do whatever the heck you want, nobody cares, and whether you're obliged to release it. But what's consistent is that people are expected to, or to, there's a social contract that you should support, that you should sustain the thing that you are consuming.
Yeah. Okay. There was, I don't know, I don't even know if it's died down or not, but I know there were a lot of kind of like prominent stories about companies or projects that were building things that were open source, Apache licensed, and then there were folks did start to do those derivative works and stand on the shoulders of those giants and start to make real money and start to productize and start to rake in millions and millions of dollars. And there was some of this, like, they're flipping the switch on the licensing and saying, okay, none of that. I'm doing this for fun. I'm doing this to I'm not doing this to make other people millions of dollars. How do you think that has impacted the kind of the open source world? And maybe if you have a better take on, I'm probably explaining that very poorly, but that's kind of the gist of the way I understand how those things went down.
I mean, there's a number of flavors of that. There's software projects who have observed companies making a huge profit and not contributing anything back, and they've attempted to put licenses in place that says this is free for everyone's use, but not you. And that is not in line with the OSI, the Open Source Initiative's definition of what open source is, because there's this field of use is one of the clauses. You cannot restrict field of use. And so some of those projects have opted to go non-open source in order to prevent the strip mining. Not a favorite term of mine, but it's an effective one. These people consuming without contributing back, not sustaining the land, not sustaining the ecosystem. Another flavor of this, of course, is when a business releases something as open source, and then another larger business builds a bigger business around that than the originator of the software was able to do. And, full disclosure here, I work for Amazon, and there have been instances where a small company has released something as open source, making a tidy profit on it. Amazon or Google or Microsoft has made a much larger fortune on that thing. And the smaller companies calls foul. They say, no fair. You are consuming without helping us in any way, which of course the license allows. But like I said, there's a social contract there. And then that smaller company says, all right, never mind, this isn't open anymore. And it forces a crisis in that project. And how that crisis is resolved, it might be a fork, it might be that we choose to use something else. But my department at Amazon was created to help the company be better team players, be better community participants.
Nice.
And so what I do in my day job is work with departments within my company that consume open source and help them understand how to participate in the upstream community in a sustaining way rather than in a draining way. And that's my whole day job, and I love it. But, it's fair to say, I was 2 weeks ago, I was at FOSSE, which is a free and open source conference. And it's fair to say that hyperscalers, so big cloud companies like Google and Microsoft and Amazon, are frequently frowned upon for their consumption without contributing back. It's just kind of a thing that we get chastised for. So that's my day job.
Yeah, the forks, that's the interesting, and there's some of those forks land at Apache. I know like OpenTofu is one that's landed at Apache.
I don't think OpenTofu is at Apache, is it?
They're not your guys? I thought they landed at...
But yeah, some of them do. Pecco is an example
that was one I was thinking
of a fork where a company closed their license and the community said, well, we don't care about you, we'll just keep going. Yeah. And that landed at Apache.
Yeah. I haven't had a chance. I had used Akka and I liked it very much. I don't know that I've used Pecco since the split. I haven't used Akka either. I hadn't had an opportunity to, but if I do get around to it, I probably will reach for Pecco, since it's Apache licensed now. Nothing wrong with the wonderful folks at Lightbend, but that's what I would do. Okay. This is, it's great to have these conversations about open source with, somebody that I know knows this world very well. And I don't know that a lot of people understand open source. What they see now is like, I just write something, I just throw it out on GitHub. That's open source. And there's a lot of these kind of stranded projects out there that, nobody's listening to. A lot of mine or nobody was listening to. Do you think, are you for that kind of like disparate efforts of, kind of the individuals just throwing their stuff out there, or do you, I don't know, what's your take on that? Is it better for the community to have all of this stuff going on, or is it watering it down, or is it just making it harder for those jewels to shine? Like what do you think is the better outcome for how this open source world has evolved over the years?
I think it's always been the case in human history that 90% of everything is crap. And, if people weren't publishing their stuff all the way back to the Gutenberg press, we wouldn't have those gems. And so I think that having individuals publish their idea for public view, even though most of it's going to be garbage and most of it's going to be ignored, is how we lead to these great ideas. Because, when I'm trying to solve a problem, the first thing I ask is, surely someone else has solved this problem before. Let's go look. And 9 times out of 10, I will find a thing out there which has an interesting solution that's not done yet. And I will either try to participate in that community or I'll take it as inspiration to move on. And when I say community, you're right. A lot of these are just individuals with single developer projects that they threw it out there and abandoned it. But that can be the gem that leads to something. And so I think that this is really valuable. I think that the SourceForge and the Google Code and today the GitHub has led to a richness of experimentation that leads to those few gems. And I really celebrate this, and it's what has led to many of my own solutions that I wouldn't have come up with on my own, but I see, this is an interesting approach. Let's combine these 3 things and come up with a new thing. And yeah, you want to credit those other things, but then you go your own way. So yeah, I'm definitely in favor of that model.
Okay. And you're smarter than me in more ways than one, but in that aspect, like when I try something new, I realize, there's a problem. I get so involved in falling in love with the problem. I want to solve it myself. I'm a puzzle guy, right? And I want to dive in. And then 3 weeks later, I do the thing you just said you do first, which is like, wait a minute. What have other people done here? And then I'm like, oh, yeah, I could have saved myself 3 weeks of heartache by looking at this.
But if you enjoyed that, that was a valuable experience, right?
I do.
Puzzle solving is brain exercise. But one of the things that we do in open source is we tend to think only I can save the world. And
right.
We don't look at other folks, and we don't look outside of software. And one of the things that I try to do in my community development work is always look at other fields of study. And so like when I was doing ApacheCon, and now that I'm doing Community Over Code, I try to invite keynote speakers that are from outside technology, and they come in and they provide interesting insight that can spark a conversation, that can spark solutions. And so I always like to invite science fiction authors. Last year, we invited a carpenter who unfortunately was unable to come due to a personal tragedy, but he used to run a carpentry show on PBS, and he was talking in our conversations, he was talking about using tools that are handed down over generations to solve problems. That sounds like open source. So
Yeah,
yeah, I always like to go outside of our expertise to find insights.
that would have been a really cool
It would have
keynote.
been. I'm hoping we can
Yeah,
get him to come again sometime.
that's really cool. I think I know the guy you're talking about. He uses like the old style tools
Yeah.
instead of like, a machine, drill and all that. Yeah, that's awesome. Okay. Well, that's it for the core section of our show. We have to move on to the next section, which we call Ship It or Skip It.
Ship or skip, everybody, we gotta tell us if you ship or skip.
And this is kind of our take on hot or not. I would be interested to hear your take on doing these in-person events. We live in a very remote world, especially since COVID, of course. We were remote, quite a bit, at least on the technology side before COVID, but COVID, of course, pushed everyone or a lot of folks in that direction. What's it like, getting on a plane and going and meeting other people around the world these days? Is that something you recommend doing? Is it too much of a hassle? Are people embracing it still? What's going on with the in-person events world?
I definitely recommend it. I think that sitting down and having a meal with somebody is the most important thing in conflict resolution. And conflicts happen all the time in open source. We're extremely opinionated people, and I'm right and you're wrong, and that can lead to unnecessary personal conflicts. And showing up at an event, sitting across the table from somebody, having a meal, understanding that they are more than just their code, that they also have weird hobbies like emotional support kales, just like you do, can be really, really formative. But I'll also say that this is an enormous privilege that I have. I have a job that allows me to go to exotic places around the world and covers my expenses. And I'm very cognizant that that's a huge privilege that not everyone shares. And so I also am a strong believer in local tech communities that have these same sort of meetups and invite those people that have the privilege of traveling, bring them in. And so, like I said, next week I'm going to Togo, West Africa, and I'm so looking forward to the conversations there. And also, hopefully, I can share some of my experience and hard-won wisdom with these technologists over there as well, who don't have the privilege of traveling around the world because it's expensive.
Sure, absolutely. Huh. Yeah, I think for a while I did enjoy the remote aspect. I think I was able to join the London Java user group. I joined some of their stuff during COVID because I could, and they're only 5 hours ahead, so I could crash their party, and they were very welcoming, and it was great to meet some of those folks.
But what you lack on those remote events is the social aspect, because some conferences have done a really good job of building in a social hour at the end, tacked onto the end of the conference. But the hallway track at a conference, and those of you that don't go to a lot of conferences, the hallway track just means the fortuitous conversation with that person that you bump into the hallway about whatever comes to mind. That's such an important aspect that you simply don't get in an online conference where there's a set topic. We're going to talk about this for an hour and everything else is out of bounds. And when I go to a conference, we invariably end up talking about crafts and art and cooking and all of these things that are off topic in the formal session online.
Yeah, it's funny when we do interviewing. Those are a lot of like woodworking. Most technologists have a guitar somewhere in the background of some sort of a string instrument, usually a guitar. Woodworking, cooking is a big one, right? A lot of people, there are a lot of foodies in the technology business. It's just something to do outside of what we do with our hands and a creative effort. But I do think what we do is creative. There's some creativity there. What about we ask a lot of our folks about this vibe coding. Kind of what's your, maybe first give your definition of what you would consider to be vibe coding, and then kind of your take. Where do you think that is that a good thing for us as humans, or is it a bad?
I think that the term vibe coding itself sounds kind of pejorative to me. It sounds like I'm going to code without really understanding the concept. And I think that when it started, and it feels like ancient history, but this is what, a year ago?
Back in our day. Yeah.
I think that what it's evolved into is, at least for me, I don't just kind of sit down and chat with the computer. I think about the overall structure and I define what I want a thing to do. And that's more than a vibe. That's planning. And it reminds me of the old days of documentation-driven development and test-driven development, where before you wrote the first line of code, you would write a document that described the project. And we've come back around to that, I think. You don't just sit down and start writing, 10 go to 20. You think about the overall structure. And to me, that's what vibe coding has become. And I think that it is the future of open source, because it allows you to, like I said at the very beginning, it allows you to bring in the subject matter experts who are not coders to describe the problem. And describing the problem is the first step to solving the problem. As technologists, we like to jump to the solution and we like to jump to the specific technology that we're going to use. And vibe coding, although I hate the term, it allows you to take a step back and describe the problem. And to me, that's always been a critical part of software engineering, is describing what problem you're actually trying to solve. And to use Amazon phraseology, it's being customer obsessed. It's talking to the actual person who has the problem and solve it. So again, don't like the term, but big fan of the process.
So the idea kind of there would be technology helping us streamline that process of taking the words coming from the person who has the problem into more kind of getting it to the technical side and into a real implementation of the solution.
That's right.
Facilitating that. I like that. Yeah, I mean, I've said all along, I love the democratization of this, and I love that it can, generative AI and AI in particular can help folks, as you said, explain what they want and bridge that gap and actually give them agency to build something. And maybe whether it's a crude prototype or not, it doesn't matter, but it's something that can now embody their ideas, and I think that is a good thing. I think we have to take those and make that, embrace the idea and be able to take those ideas and those solutions and take them, like if you're going to productize or operationalize or something like that, take a wrap around that and say, okay, now let's make this like a thing for the enterprise or a thing for if it's a business or whatever. We have to figure out how to do that well. But yeah, I like the idea. But there is the other side of the, that slop thing that's happening to open source, which is that's very unfortunate. Okay. What about, so you have a history, you did work for Red Hat, I believe, if I remember correctly.
You were Red Hat for 9 years.
Yeah. Well, I remember you having the Red Hat emblem on your account for a long time.
God.
There, yeah, you got your Red Hat, and he's putting on the fit. Love Red Hat. I've always loved Red Hat, because people always talk about like the Red Hat model, and that, maybe kind of briefly explain that, and then like, is that dead? Can the Red Hat model does that still work today? Is it different nowadays with AI? Is it different?
I think it's still a relevant model. I know that there are folks that say you can never reproduce what Red Hat did, and maybe that's true in that particular niche. But the Red Hat model is, Red Hat doesn't sell software. It sells solutions around the software. And that might mean documentation and help you set it up and packaging. So the big Red Hat product is Red Hat Enterprise Linux, where they take a free thing and they give it to you for free, but they wrap it in a container that makes it easier to consume and use and puts all the bits together. And of course, Linux is not useful as just the operating system. There's millions, hundreds of thousands anyway, of tools that come along with it, from your editor to your web server to your DNS server, whatever, all of these components that come along with it. And Red Hat produces that useful package. And then it gives you advice and services and help in making that work for your environment. But the software itself is always free. You can always obtain the source code, and you can always decide that you're not interested in Red Hat's support model and go your own way. And that's one of the main open source based, that's one of the main business models around how do we make money from a thing which is intrinsically free.
is do you find the Red Hat model to be one of the more palatable? I don't know how to phrase that. None of them are bad, right? The business models around open source, none of them are really bad. I think people get a bad taste in their mouth, as we talked before, about nobody contributing back. But the Red Hat model itself, is it one of the more palatable from the open source community of a way of making money?
It is to me. I tend to think that if you are consuming something that someone else has created for free, that you should be a participant in sustaining that, and that you shouldn't just be, stealing the eggs from the golden goose. But I've never started an open source business directly. I did web development for a while, and everything that I produced was free, and what I was charging for was my custom solutions. And so that's one model in open source, is producing custom solutions on top of open source project and selling your labor. Now, whether that produced thing is then free for public consumption, which is what I did, or whether that company that paid you to do it keeps it, that's a decision between you and your customer. Another model is what we call open core, which is the core of your thing is free and open source. But if you want it to do this extra shiny special thing, you got to pay me extra for it. And there are a lot of companies that are in that open core space where they give away the free thing. And, maybe they even put a lot of time and effort into producing that free thing. But the value add on super duper version, you have to pay extra for.
Gotcha.
And to me, even within that, there's two flavors of it. There are companies that make the free thing useless by itself. Crippleware is one of the rather unfortunate terms for that.
I was about to use the word it's hobbled, and then you use crippled. No,
it's hobbled. You can download and install the free thing, but if you actually want to use it for real work, you have to pay me extra. And to me, that's a little unpalatable. I think that the free thing, the community edition, should be usable. And one of the reasons that it's unpalatable is that these companies often use their influence in the community to prevent the community from producing those value-added features. And so someone in the community might produce a free plugin that does the super duper thing, and the company will use their influence to squash that. And to me, that's the part of it that is anti-community. But, there are good and ethical ways to do open core, and you see a whole range of companies in that space. So, and then the third model is what my company does, which is hosting. Apache Kafka, amazing project, does really cool things, and really smart people can set it up and run it themselves, but maybe you don't want to. Maybe setting up and running it yourself is a pain that you'd rather outsource. And so you outsource it to Amazon Web Services. We run managed streaming for Apache Kafka, and all you have to do is show up and use it. So that's the hosting model, and there's a ton of companies that do that at different levels. Red Hat does that to a certain extent. The big hosting providers, Google and Microsoft and IBM and AWS, do this hosted open source model. If you want Kafka, you know where to get it. If you don't want the hassle of running it yourselves, we do that for you.
Yeah, and I think it's worth it. I mean, I've paid for the hosted because it's tough to set up and run and do it effectively, and let someone else do all that homework, and that is the value that they had. So I don't have a problem with that. What about, and we're in Ship It or Skip It, but I came up with an idea for a question. I recently had a conversation with Agentic AI Foundation, which is a sub-foundation of the Linux Foundation, one of the sub-foundations. Great conversation. They're doing some really cool stuff. The model context protocol's there, A2A is now there. So they're kind of bunching up all of these things. If you had to give advice, you've been around the block, you've seen this. There was always money involved in Apache. There was a lot of companies involved, Red Hat, IBM, all of them, they were contributing. But I think this may be an unprecedented amount of money being poured into these things in particular. I don't know. I don't have any data to back that up, but it seems like there's a lot more money going on around AI and all this stuff right now. What would be your advice to those guys and gals to say, here's how you can kind of keep this thing from going off the rails with all that money? pouring in and being invested in around this stuff to keep it from getting nasty or whatever? What advice would you give?
So the advice that I do give when folks are joining a foundation like that is to focus on governance. Make sure that governance is well documented. And when I use the term governance, what I mean is who makes the decisions? How can I become that person? And making sure that governance is open, making sure that not all of the decisions are being made by Sam Altman. To me, that's critical. And I don't know Sam. I'm not trying to disparage him, but putting all of the decision-making power in the hands of the people who stand to profit tends to produce solutions that benefit the people who have all the money and stand to profit. And crafting governance that weighs all voices equal as near as possible, it produces better solutions that are customer focused, that are user focused, rather than solutions that are investor focused. And to me, that is the most important thing: is clear governance with a path for anybody, so that a college student in Dubai can become a governing board member, that you don't have to put in $1 million in order to become a governing board member. To me, that's
pay to play.
Critical.
Yeah, the kind of pay to play model. Yeah. I think the things I worry about is with those situations, when there's money involved, there's always going to be some crazy, right? What I worry about is, as you said, one person gaining undue influence. But then also, if you do level the playing field, and you reach almost like this detente of like the watered down version of the thing. I feel like the core can't evolve in the best product way, because everybody's like, no, if you do that, my shiny bits of how I do this thing, they're now in the core. And so there's like this, I don't know, you get to like the least common denominator. I don't know how to phrase it the best way, but that's kind of what I worry about, is like you're just watering the thing down and it just becomes, I don't know. Is that a concern for you?
It is a concern. And so I think that the thing about governance is there has to be a ladder to climb to governance. And you climb the ladder to governance in open source by doing the work. And when you can buy a seat at the top of the ladder, then you bypass the earning trust. And earning trust and demonstrating merit, demonstrating that you have good ideas, not just that you have good ideas, but that you're willing to do the work to take ownership and make those ideas happen. That's how you rise to that decision-making capacity. And I think that although in theory, opening the floodgates means that everybody's going to come in and have a say, what we've seen in practice is even for extremely critical things like Linux, like Hadoop, there's really only a dozen people that are actually willing to do the work and become part of that leadership. And so it's almost self-filtering. You can open the floodgates, you can let everybody have a say. Doesn't mean you have to listen to everybody. It means that you listen to the people that are actually willing to do the work to make it happen.
And if I remember this correctly, I think someone said Apache is a meritocracy, and I've heard people counter that with no, Apache is a doocracy.
Yeah.
As you said, people willing to do the work is how you kind of...
And the term meritocracy itself is a little bit problematic, because the people who determine merit are the people who already have merit, and so they tend to determine people that look like themselves. And so you do see a lot of people in leadership at open source that look like me, the 50-year-old white man with a beard. And I feel like there have been moments in open source where we've started to break away from that. You definitely see a lot more diversity on many axes: corporate, gender, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, than we saw back in the 90s. Yeah. But it's still a problem that meritocracy as a concept tends to make us select people that look like ourselves. And so I do like the doocracy thing, but it also has to be paired with a willingness to let people do. And, one of the things that I'm trying really hard to do at Apache is create opportunities for people to step up and do work without having to, run the gauntlet of proving themselves. They can say, I can do that thing, and let that be sort of the path into maybe I can do that bigger thing. And that's something that has to be very intentional. This is not something that happens automatically. And the mindset in open source tends to be, if we say you can participate, then people will show up and participate. But humans aren't like that. Humans need encouragement, and they need folks to say thank you, and they need the defined opportunity to say, this thing that I could do is actually useful.
Yeah, because you got to feel like, if I'm going to make the investment in my time and blood, sweat, and tears, that it's going to be valued by someone, Yeah, I know, I'm with you on that. All right. Well, I think that's great advice, and hopefully, man, they're going to have an interesting road ahead of them with all the money around AI right now. So that'll be an interesting road. Hopefully, they are able to keep that thing on the rails. Okay. Well, that's it for Ship It or Skip It. We had a little bit of a detour, which was fine. We're on to our lightning round.
It's time for the lightning round. Rapid fire, don't slow down. Answer quick and make it count. In this game, there's no way out. It's time for the lightning round.
So the lightning round, I don't know if you've listened to the podcast, but this is the meat and potatoes of the show. This is what everybody tunes in for. They fast forward through all the stuff we just said, so it doesn't matter what we said. Nobody's listening. They're tuning in for this lightning round. Right. These are the hard hitting questions. These are the things this is really going to get to. This is what makes society better. Is the answers to the questions we have here, right? And this is very important. We score this, we grade this. There's a leaderboard, and I mean This is the Super Bowl of our show. I just want to. I say that just to make sure you're able to mentally prepare.
All right,
and yeah,
I'm ready.
Okay, good. I hope so. I wish you luck. What's your favorite season of the year?
Summer, absolutely summer. I'm a African kid. I like it hot. I like it humid, and I hate being cold. So definitely summer.
Can you run? Are you a runner?
I used to be. I was a runner in high school and college, and then I got old knees. I'm more of a biker now, although I'm not really keeping up with that either. But yeah, I used to be a runner.
All right. If you were really hungry, would you eat a bug?
I guess I would, because I have. Mm-hmm. I growing up in Kenya, the flying ants, the termites would come up out of the ground, and we'd run around and catch them and eat them. So that was less because I was super hungry. It was more on a dare. But yeah, if I was real hungry, I would eat a bug.
If you were given the opportunity to fly into space, given today's technology, would you take that opportunity?
Absolutely. I would jump on that in a heartbeat.
Well, and this is like somebody whose code is on those ships. So you got a high degree of confidence.
Yeah,
there, so
I grew up reading Ray Bradbury. One of my favorite books is Martian Chronicles. I would love to visit Mars, even though that it's not a practical thing that'll happen in my lifetime. So yeah, I'd definitely do that.
Well, you never know. He's going to get us there, I guess. So scale of 1 to 10, what would you rate yourself at wiffle ball?
Wiffle ball, maybe a 2.
Maybe a 2. It can be complex it spins a lot. There's a lot of movement on that ball. If everyone in the world had to get married when they reached a certain age, what would that age be?
32. I think that before 32, I was not emotionally mature enough to be married. I did it anyway, and it was not the wisest decision of my life. But I think by 32, I knew who I was well enough that I could be with someone.
My wife, if she were to answer that about me, would probably say some age older than I am right now. I'm guessing. I don't know. Let's see. She probably would. She really did. Have you ever worn socks with sandals?
I think so. It's not something I do regularly. I don't wear sandals a lot, but yeah, I'm sure that I've done that at some point in my life.
Here one that we've been asking a lot of folks through the last several months. Just a continuous kind of social experiment, if you will, on the / here. Do you like the smell of gasoline?
No, I don't like the smell of gasoline. I hate having it on my hands after filling the tank. Yeah.
No. Can you touch your toes without bending your knees?
Not anymore.
Nope. Here's one of the questions, which is kind of silly for you. Have you ever been to Africa? I know the answer to that one.
Twice.
Yeah, once or twice. Let's see here. Okay, maybe you'll answer this. Some people don't like to answer this one. What's a country that you would be okay never visiting in your life?
Man, that is a hard question. I really don't have an answer to that. I want to go to all of them.
Yeah, I mean, I think I would at least give it any country a try because I think there's good things about every country, you know?
For sure. There's
Yeah.
beauty everywhere, even though some of those countries have some appalling governments. Yeah, I honestly don't have an answer to that.
That's fair. When you fly on a plane, are you wearing a neck pillow when you fly?
Yes.
Yep.
Yeah.
Again, these are the hard-hitting questions, right? 1 to 10, how much do you enjoy garlic?
8.
That's a good score. This one we usually save for around the kind of the end of the year towards the holidays, but every now and then I'll spring it on someone. What do you feel about cranberries?
I don't like cranberries. Cranberries make my tongue itch. I think I might have a slight allergy even. They make my mouth pucker and feel sore for a couple days.
No kidding.
Yeah.
Huh. I wonder if it's one of those, like, isn't it pineapple that has like an enzyme in it that actually eats your flesh or something? And like my daughter, it bugs her tongue a lot to eat pineapple. She won't eat pineapple because I guess she's just more
I love
susceptible
pineapples,
to them.
but yeah, they do definitely burn your mouth.
Yeah. Do you find handlebar mustaches to be handsome?
I really don't. I mean, like what you like, and people should do what they want with their own physique, but no, that's not something I care for.
Not a thing you would do. Okay, well, I think that wraps it up for the lightning round. I feel pretty good about your score. I say that every week, but I really do this time. You know, that's not to say that I didn't for all the other times. Anyway, we're going to wrap up here. We've talked about open source with someone who's been in the thick of it. It's been insightful. I think you have a perspective about open source that not a lot of people on the planet would even have, right? So thank you so much for coming on the show. Anything in closing? What do you mentioned Togo you've got coming up? Are you writing any new books? Do you have any other events or anything you'd like to share that's coming up for you?
My next big thing that I'm a big part of is communityovercode.org, which, as I mentioned, is the new name for the Apache Software Foundation conference. And we would love to see folks there that are involved in open source in any way. So yeah, I think that's the thing that I would want to push. I'd also ask people to look at community.apache.org, which is my primary passion right now. It's what I'm dumping all of my free time into, and this is building communities around Apache projects and helping folks share their best practice and wisdom around open source and learn from each other and really just have fun and enjoy it.
Great. And you have a podcast, or you do episodes of an interview style type thing. I've seen you talking to some folks. What's that? What is that show? Where do we plug in to see that?
I do +1.apache.org, where I do interviews with the folks that are involved in Apache projects or anything around the Apache ecosystem. It is extremely sporadic. I try to do one a month, but it's not always that good. But I do love talking with people about their projects, and I tend to focus on the problem. What problem does this thing solve? Why did you do this in the first place? Who's using it and for what to make the world a better place, rather than on the nitpicky technical details.
Yeah. Very cool. Yeah. I love the name +1 for those who don't know. When you do code changes and stuff at Apache, people will vote on things or ideas that you want to change.
-1.
You'll +1 -1. That's how they do the voting. So that's a really cool name. All right. Well, again, this has been really great. Again, I always enjoy speaking with you, and thank you again for your mentorship through the years, and appreciate you coming on.
Well, thanks for the opportunity. This was a fun chat, and there's so many other things to talk about, but
yeah,
thanks for keeping us focused.
Yeah, we can do more episodes. I think it'd be a blast. Maybe I'll come down and do an on location. You live like an hour and a half. I just dropped my daughter off down in the UK, down in your neck of the woods. So, all right. Well, if you'd like to get in touch with us here at the /, drop us a line at the/@caliberty.com. See you next time. The / podcast is created by Caliberty. The / team is director and producer Ryan Wilson, editing by Steve Baradelli, marketing support by Taylor Blessing, and I'm your host, James Carman. Thanks for listening.